Yo, what's going on, guys? It's G Miners here. A lot of people in the Destiny community have been making a ton of these tier list videos for exotics, weapons, and other things recently. Sweat just put one out for Lost Sectors. Patty Cake's been making these for a while now, and I'm unoriginal, so I decided to hop on the bandwagon. But what's not unoriginal is the brand new Zombie Slayer themed shaker cups over at gamersupps.com. Buy one and get a free pack of samples with it, and while you're at it, use code GM for 10% off your entire purchase. As you saw in the title, we are going to be going over all the exotic primaries in the game, so that's anything that uses primary ammo, and we're going to be ranking it whether it's trash, whether it's meta, or anything in between. As I mentioned, Patty Cakes is super well known for doing these. This is where I got the idea to do it for the PvE side of things, so make sure to go drop him some love and check out his channel. The tier list I'm using in today's video, I went ahead and made completely on tier maker myself. I'll have a link to that in the description below if you and your friends want to go and do that yourself, or just buy yourself because you're lonely, and then you can send it to me on Twitter. Speaking of which, you should follow my Twitter. Okay, thank you, bye. I forgot to mention this, but just for simplicity, S tier are going to be weapons that are good in high level content. These are things like day 1 raids, GMs, master raids, and even things like speedruns. A tier are still great weapons to use for certain activities and can be used in endgame content. B tier are going to be solid weapons to use depending on seasonal mods and builds. C tier are fun weapons to use and can be useful, but not really in the highest level of content. D tier are just bad weapons that might be fun to mess around with in low-level activities like strikes and casual raids. And then F tier are going to be weapons that are absolute trash and should not be touched in PvE, which generally means they are PvP-only weapons. We are starting off with Tommy's Matchbook. Auto rifles in general are not the strongest exotics for PvE, and Tommy's Matchbook is one of the worst out of all of them. Ignition Trigger increases damage, but not by that much, and Heatsink helps, but also makes your accuracy tank, so the synergy of these perks is really not that great. The Catalyst is decent, but at the end of the day, this is only useful for fun builds and messing around in PvE, so we are starting this list off with our first D tier. Vex Mythoclast is a weapon that everybody knows and loves from D1. Last season with Particle Deconstruction, this thing was a hard meta in GMs, and even usable in Master Vogue. Without this buff, I think that Vex can still hold its own since it can double as a special and a primary weapon. In seasons where we get more Fusion Rifle champion mods, I think this weapon will be right back to where it once was, which is why I am putting it as A tier. The brand new Raid Pulse Collective Obligation is actually kind of a beast. The exotic perk allows you to harness suppression, weaken, and volatile effects, and when running this with Devour, you never have to reload. I think this season, with Void 3.0 being stronger than ever, makes this weapon seem a bit above its fighting weight though. After all, many legendaries like Funnel Web are going to be great with Void subclasses, so this is going to go down as a B tier weapon. Next up is the Exotic Bow Tikus. This weapon has an extremely useful combo and is also great for Grandmaster Nightfalls. I haven't used it a ton myself, but have seen people like Salt and Vendetta use this to solo GMs, which means it is definitely a top tier weapon. I think depending on seasonal champion mods, this falls off a bit. For me, this falls right under the S tier as our second A tier weapon. Devil's Ruin is a great weapon in my opinion and actually does pretty decent damage even though sidearms get no love in D2. It also has built-in unstop, which means if sidearms ever do become meta, this will be one of the best options for GMs, but in its current state, I think this weapon is a solid C tier. Right after that, we have another C tier weapon in my opinion, which is the Symmetry. I don't think I've touched this weapon for years, and even then, I think the only time I have really used it is in PvP. I think this is still going to be better than a lot of other weapons since it is a scout rifle, so you can play back with it, and the exotic perk does actually deal a ton of damage, but for now, it's more of a fun weapon than anything else. So once again, C tier. Next up, we have Teraba. This thing used to be complete trash, but recently got a buff that makes it slightly better. Some people think this buff made it meta, but honestly, the buff was only half of what it really needs to be. I'm putting this as B tier. If Bungie just finally made the charge on this weapon stay exactly where it is when swapping weapons, this would easily be A tier, maybe even an S tier weapon. Polaris Lance is a weapon that I have only ever used in PvE for the old Prestige Leviathan-esque raids. These would force you to use certain weapons like scouts depending on the week, and that is the only time I found it useful to run this. The exotic perk is super underwhelming, so this is an easy D tier. Risk Runner, on the other hand, is a weapon that has maintained its spot in the meta for a while. The biggest benefit from this weapon is the reduced incoming arc damage, which makes it great for endgame content. This weapon also chains lightning between adds and returns ammo to the magazine, so in the right environment, this is the best weapon in the game to use, which is why this is going to be our first S tier weapon. Sunshot has been around since the launch of D2 and has always been a solid option. This weapon excels in solar builds, especially since the release of elemental well mods. It also has great ad clear and overall stats like insane range, but it isn't something I would take into content higher than legend difficulty, so for that reason, I think it is a solid B tier option. Fighting Lion is the next weapon on this list, and it is terrible. Honestly, complete trash, but it does run off of primary ammo, which means in certain situations, I think it could be useful seeing as it is infinite grenade launcher ammo. I still think that the exotic perks are not that exotic, so definitely, as of right now, a D tier weapon. Skyburner's Oath is a weapon that I have not seen since year 2 of Destiny. This thing is pretty much a dust collector, and even back in the day, there was only one real build that I ever saw this thing used for. There is no use for this weapon in the current game, which means this is our first F tier weapon. Don't use it. Flamin' Arc, on the other hand, might just be one of the best weapons in the game, and even better with the release of Void 3.0. This thing chunks the health of champions in GMs this season, especially if using volatile rounds. The poison is also great for stunning anti-barriers and overloads, and killing large groups of adds when you get those crispy headshots that spread its effect over a large area. I might be a bit biased because this is one of my favorite weapons right now, but this is going down as our second S tier. Right after this, we have Trinity Ghoul. For just one single weapon alone, the only thing that I think can actually compete with the ad clear of this is Risk Runner. Chain Lightning is just that strong against rank and files. Even though this isn't the best bow for GMs or master content, it is incredibly useful in speedruns and low man clears, so it is also going in the S tier slot. Hardlight is the next weapon on the list. As I mentioned, auto rifles tend not to be the best choice for your exotic slot, but in certain activities, Hardlight had a ton of potential. Having one player on Hardlight to rip shields in match game activities meant that the other two players were free to run whatever they wanted. When Auto had anti-barrier rounds available, that made running Hardlight even more viable, which is why I am putting it as an A tier weapon. Another weapon that has been around since the launch of D2 is Graviton Lance. This 2-round burst pulse rifle is super unique and can also be great for ad clear. I haven't had a chance to mess around with this while using Void 3.0, but overall, Graviton always felt a bit underwhelming. The hit recognition felt weird on a 2-burst, and the exotic perk didn't always seem to proc correctly. Nonetheless, it is still super fun to use and still useful in some aspects, so I think this is a solid B tier option. With weapon number 17 on this list, we are now onto the Kinetic Primary weapons, first of which is Hawkmoon. This is an OG D1 God tier exotic, but it's only really God tier in the Crucible. It can be fun to use in PvE, but definitely not useful, which is why it is a perfect fit in the D tier row. The next kinetic we have is No Time to Explain. This is definitely another exotic that shines far brighter in the Crucible than in PvE, but it can still be super fun to use. The Gun Buddy and Arc Soul can be paired together to make yourself into your own fire team, and if you wanted, you could even add the new Avoid Soul too. Fun weapon to use, so no better place for this than the C tier. Osteostriga is a brand new kinetic SMG that is basically if Thorn had been designed for PvE. This thing pairs great with Necrotics, but is easily usable on any other class. The ad clear is great, and it also works well in endgame content. And then to top all that off, the catalyst is amazing and the weapon is craftable so players can tweak it to their liking. Easily an A tier weapon. DMT is a weapon that I think, depending on the person you ask, they will either throw this in the F tier or the S tier. Overall, I think the weapon can hold its own in PvE, but people tend to overhype using it with Vorpal Weapon against anti-barrier champions. I think this is a decent exotic to use if your slot is free, so it belongs in the B tier. Speaking of overhyped weapons, we have the Traveler's Chosen. Every time I make a build video that revolves around ability regen, somebody always tries to convince me that Traveler's Chosen is a better option than what I'm running. I think the ability regen is great, but if you take this thing into any form of endgame content, you are going to get murdered. Super fun to use, but not the most practical, which makes this weapon C tier in my eyes. Back at auto rifles, we have the Monte Carlo. This weapon is good for one thing and one thing only, which are melee builds in D2. Since Shoulder Charge and Peregrine Greaves are back in the meta, for now, I think this weapon is in the B tier. Enough said. Lumina is a great hand cannon with a great exotic perk to use if you want to carry some new players through a raid and keep them alive, but other than that, I think this weapon really falls off. I don't think it's worth the exotic slot for what it offers, but it is still a 140 and is super fun to use, so I'll put this in the C tier. Next up for the exotic hand cannons is Thorn. Definitely much more of a PvP weapon, but if you're on Warlock and running Necrotic Grips, this thing is insane. Its infinite ad clear and never needing to reload make it feel great. In general, on other classes, it is more of a D tier weapon, but I'm assuming if you're running an exotic, you are using it where it is most useful, so we are putting this in the C tier as well. Number 24 on the list is Malfeasance. Malfeasance is super fun to use, but unless you are running Lucky Pants, this thing is borderline useless. Easy weapon to throw right in the D tier. Speaking of useless weapons, we have our next F tier, which is the Suros Regime. This weapon is just not viable in any activity nor worth the exotic slot, and it isn't even that fun to use. Once again, enough said. The exotic hand cannon Crimson, on the other hand, is definitely useful in PvE. I think this weapon can honestly be a great crutch to use for new players or even those who are a bit less experienced and want to safely go for something like a flawless raid or flawless dungeon clear. Healing after every kill is extremely strong, and to top that off, you never need to reload. As the difficulty scales up in D2, this weapon does fall off heavily, so C tier is where it belongs in my opinion. That brings us to Vigilance Wing. This is a crucible weapon that really doesn't have a place anywhere in PvE, so this is going straight next to the Suros Regime in the F tier. The same exact thing is true for both of the next two weapons. Sturm and Might of Multitool are both OG D2 exotics that have been around since launch and have never made it to the PvE side of Destiny. Both are top tier options for PvP, but for the sake of this list, they again belong in the F tier. Number 30 on this list is the Huckleberry. This is another great exotic primary weapon with OG Rampage and a bottomless mag. I wouldn't say that this is always worth the exotic slot moving up towards master level content, but it definitely holds its own in most other areas. As far as SMGs go, I think it is on par with Osteo and a bit better than Teraba, so we are putting this straight into the A tier. Next up is Wish Ender, which is honestly just kind of terrible. It definitely hits like a truck, but is also more of a PvP weapon, allowing you to see through walls. I don't see any reason to run this ever, so I am throwing it in the F tier. Bad Juju is our first kinetic pulse rifle, and I personally think this thing is super underrated. I don't think it is the best weapon in the game, but it is pretty much a pulse rifle version of the Huckleberry that also gives you super energy. Naturally, pulse rifles are not quite as good as SMGs, so I think it is fair to put this as a B tier weapon. The other kinetic pulse rifle we have is Outbreak Prime, which as many people know is one of the best exotics in all of D2. Not only was this once a DPS meta primary, but it also has insane ad clear with the nanites it generates. The synergies between each of the weapon's perks and the catalyst is also amazing, so Outbreak is easily going in the S tier row. Last Word is another OG Destiny 1 exotic that's been brought to D2. This weapon is another PvP weapon, but with the buff to Lucky Pants last season, this weapon had insane damage potential for a primary. I don't think it's the most useful weapon in the game, but it is definitely better than other options out there, so D tier seems reasonable. Ace of Spades, on the other hand, is a hand cannon that I think is extremely useful. Again, it isn't something that I'm going to be taking into GMs, but having Firefly and Memento Mori makes this feel very similar to Midnight Q. Overall, it is just a super solid 140 hand cannon to play around with and use for fun, but can also be used in raids, dungeons, and some medium difficulty activities, so Ace of Spades is going into the C tier row. Cerberus +1 is another one of those exotics that is super cool, but just not that useful. The exotic perk doesn't really make it stand out in terms of performance, and honestly, most legendary options in the game are way better than this. If it got a buff and just fired as fast as other autos while dealing shotgun damage, then it would be insane, but overall this weapon is a D tier as it is just super underwhelming. On the topic of underwhelming, we have the Jade Rabbit. Once again, just another PvP weapon that has no real use in PvE, so another F tier. Almost at the end of the list, we have the Rat King, hands down one of the most fun weapons to mess around with in the game, and honestly with 6 Rat Kings for DPS, it isn't that bad against many of the raid bosses in the game. At the end of the day though, other options are going to be way better, and this weapon feels like more of a meme than something that is worth running, so I think C tier is fair. And finally, last and actually kind of least on this list is the Sweet Business. Once again, this is super fun to use, but it doesn't feel that great in PvE. I'm sure it rips anti-barrier shields and is great when using Actium War Rig on Titan, but 90% of the content in the game, there are way better options to run, which means we are ending this list off with one final D tier weapon. Looking back at this list, I'm actually pretty happy with how it turned out, but I'm definitely curious as to what you guys think I got right and wrong. As I mentioned, feel free to send me your tier list on Twitter so I can see exactly what you put where, or just comment below. As always, have a good one, guys. Peace.